And indeed, week 2 of our 7-week fall series on the book Finding Yourself in Transition by Reverend Robert Brummett. And last week we talked about how we are always in the midst of change, even if our jobs and our relationships and our lives in general are stable. There's always this whirlwind of change that swirls around us, and the term that we used for this experience of what seems like constant change is deep shift. We are in deep shift, but that doesn't mean that we have to sink. We can learn to swim. We can learn to survive and then ultimately thrive even in the midst of deep shift. Change, it's a natural process, but at times we either try to fight it or force it. Last week we have this discussion group that meets after the service, and last week we talked a little bit about cultural attitudes surrounding retirement. And at one time, and maybe still today, I don't think it's as pronounced today, but at one time I recall in our culture having a very mechanical attitude about retirement. It was all about a certain age. You reached 63 or 65 at the oldest, and you were expected to retire, or they would retire you. Didn't matter what you wanted, what you still had to offer. It was just, here's your watch, there's the door, thanks for everything, now go play golf, shuffleboard, whatever. And if that's what somebody wants, that's great. And I think we all know a lot of people who have a lot of experience, a lot of wisdom, who still have a lot to offer, a lot of gifts to offer, who are shown the door because of an arbitrary retirement age. And who loses in that situation? That's a lose-lose situation. It's a loss to the person who has the gifts to share, and it's a loss to the people who could still benefit from their wisdom and experience, all because of that mechanistic paradigm. The mechanistic paradigm strikes again. And there's another side to it, of course. Sometimes it may be time for a change. Somebody may need to retire. And many times we can see the change coming if we know what to look for. But for a lot of people, they don't see the signs. They don't see the change that needs to come, and so the change will take the form of burnout or some kind of a stress-induced health crisis. And the simple fact is that the emotional pain of making a necessary change can be perceived as being greater than the physical pain of living stressed out from day to day. So that can happen too. And those are the sad stories. Those are the stories about the price that we pay for resisting change or not knowing what to look for, not knowing the signs of an ending that is coming that we perhaps need to embrace and engage somehow. So last week we introduced the 3 phases of transition, and they are the ending, the void, and the new beginning. And in the book, Robert tells us that these stages parallel an ancient ritual known as a rite of passage. A lot of these rites of passage have to do with the transition from childhood to adult. And anthropologists have found across cultures that the rite of passage has 3 stages. First, you're separated from your group. That's an ending. You're separated from your group or your tribe. You go off someplace where you are initiated into the next phase of life. And many times the rite itself involves a symbolic death and then a rebirth of the person who's going through it. And then the last part is this return to the group or to the tribe with a new identity or a new role in the group or a new set of skills and gifts that you're expected to offer. And I think that this is a really useful insight for dealing with change. It encourages us to look for the gift that is emerging that we're going to bring back to the group after we go through the transition, after we go through the rite of passage. If you look at the Bible, if you do a survey of our movies, even our TV shows, and especially our mythology, they are filled with these tales of a hero who goes through transformational change. Best example, Star Wars, right? Luke Skywalker completely loses his identity and has to discover a brand new identity under the guidance of the wise old Yoda, right? There's Yoda. And we all know what Yoda has to say about change, right? Unavoidable is change. In deep shift are we all, right? Something like that. Joseph Campbell loved Star Wars. Joseph Campbell, the great mythology expert, calls it the hero's journey. And he tells us that every single culture on this planet have their own stories about people going through transformational change. So instead of just passively reading the stories or watching the movies that are based on these archetypes, we are being invited to see ourselves in that role, to take on the role of the mythological hero in our own lives as we learn to embrace change and transition as a powerful rite of passage. That's what these movies are telling us, and they're all around us. There may be a few dragons or Darth Vaders along the way in the transition process, but eventually we find the Grail, we find the treasure or the gift if we're willing to make the trip. That's what these stories are all about. And it all begins with an ending. It begins with an ending. And our conditioning, the way we've grown up and been taught, our conditioning tells us that an ending is like a defeat. That's a big message that we get growing up. An ending is like a defeat, especially unexpected endings. Seems like a breakdown. Seems like something's gone wrong, which takes us back to that old attitude that change is bad and is something to be avoided. It's another reason why we have this phobia often towards making changes. Endings are important. Endings are important. They need to be faced consciously and not minimized, denied away, or avoided. Here's why. Robert tells us in the book that every ending is a loss. It's a fact. Every ending is a loss, and grief is the normal human response to loss. So, if we're in the habit of denying and minimizing changes, what we're doing is we are creating this huge burden of unresolved grief from all of the previous endings and losses in life. Every ending and every transition, or even a threatened ending, has the potential, at least as we see it, has the potential to release this stored up reservoir of unresolved grief from the past. And then that gets added to the natural pain of the loss or ending that's happening now. Robert tells us that at some point we may even become terrified of a minor loss or a minor change because we're concerned about this Pandora's box of misery from the unresolved grief that the next ending might open up. It's an important and powerful insight, I think. I know of some therapists I've talked to who are of the opinion that most of the problems that people are working with are due to unresolved grief issues. So there we go. In the way we deal with change, trying to deny it and minimize it, we are storing up unresolved grief. So that's why we don't want to deny and minimize endings. And at the same time, we don't want to overstate the case either. Robert likes to tell students to honor endings, but don't worship them. Honor endings, but don't worship them. Don't become your story. Good advice, again, I think. We want the Goldilocks approach when it comes to endings. Not too hot, not too cold, not too little, not too much, but we want the one that is just right. Exactly. And on a serious note, overstating and overreacting to change, overreacting to endings can have some tragic consequences. I think the saddest story is of a young person taking their life in the face of an ending because they don't have the experience to put things into perspective. They invoke a permanent solution to what everyone else understands is often a temporary problem. Anytime we look at an ending as an absolute finality, we know that we're taking it too seriously. No ending is an absolute finality. It's the beginning of a process. The loss can be permanent, but that doesn't mean it's an absolute finality. One particular relationship may be over. That could be permanent. That doesn't mean that other relationships are finished or that new ones aren't possible. Even in death, we have to acknowledge the permanent loss of someone's physical presence, but we are never, ever absolutely deprived of all the other things beyond the physical that went into making that person's life meaningful, memorable, and special to us. There's always that. Just yesterday, I came across an essay by Parker Palmer, which caused me to restructure this talk a little bit because what I read was so profound that I had to find a way to include it here today. Parker Palmer is an author, and he's the founder of an organization called the Center for Courage and Renewal. I think we have him up here. Yes, there he is, Parker Palmer at the Center for Courage and Renewal. And he's a wonderful writer. And he wrote this essay about using change, using the changing seasons as a metaphor for life. And he points out something interesting. He says that many of us have rather dysfunctional metaphors for life. And here's one that I'm familiar with and that I used to use back when I was still practicing law. I used to think of the law practice and life in general back then as a rat race, right? Anyone ever look at life as the rat race? That's your metaphor for life. Well, y'all know what the trouble with the rat race is? The trouble with the rat race is that even if you win, you're still a rat. Thank you, Lily Tomlin. Although, I guess I'd have to add, I mean, what's wrong with being a rat, actually? Aren't they cute? Don't you think rats are cute? Don't you? Yeah, see? I got you. Aw, isn't that? Well, anyway, be that as it may, how about this as a dysfunctional metaphor? Life is a battlefield, or life is a battle. If that's your metaphor, then guess what? That means there's an enemy around every corner, and you're living in a constant state of siege. Neither one of them works particularly well. So Parker Palmer prefers the metaphor of the changing seasons. And here's what he says. He says, seasons is a wise metaphor for the movement of life, I think. It suggests that life is neither a battlefield nor a game of chance, but something infinitely richer, more promising, more real. The notion that our lives are like the eternal cycle of the seasons does not deny the struggle or the joy, the loss or the gain, the darkness or the light, but encourages us to embrace it all and to find in all of it opportunities for growth. So here we are. We are in the midst of autumn, which I think is the most powerful seasonal symbol of change because it very much seems like an ending. Of all the seasons, things seem to be coming to an end. Autumn seems like a season of decline and decay, leading to the winter of death. Well, Parker Palmer says that autumn is when Mother Nature scatters the seeds that will bring new growth in the spring. And he says she scatters them with amazing abandon. That's the word that he used, the terms that he uses. Amazing abandon. And then he says this. He says, in retrospect, I can see in my own life what I could not see at the time. How the job I lost helped me find work I needed to do. How the road closed sign turned me toward terrain I needed to travel. How losses that felt irredeemable forced me to discern meanings I needed to know. On the surface, it seemed that life was lessening, but silently and lavishly the seeds of new life were always being sown. This is a wonderful example of transforming our attitude, our metaphors towards life and endings. Learning to honor them without worshiping them or trying to avoid them or minimize them. And I've given you a link. You have a link in the handout in your bulletin where you can read the entire essay. It's long and it covers all 4 of the seasons. And I highly, highly recommend reading the entire thing because it was written as if it were a meditation that was designed to go along with this book. And I suspect that if Robert were to do an updated edition of this book, that somehow this would be woven into it because, as I say, it is a wonderful meditation that seems almost designed to go with this book. So Parker goes on to quote another great spiritual teacher who I admire, Thomas Merton. And he said this, just to kind of cap things off here. He said, "There is, in all visible things, a hidden wholeness. In the visible world of nature, a great truth is concealed in plain sight. Diminishment and beauty, darkness and light, death and life are not opposites. They are held together in the paradox of the hidden wholeness." Another great insight to add to our transition toolbox, as I'm calling it now. Change reveals the hidden wholeness. Transition can show us another aspect of reality which illuminates something that was there all along, but we were unable to see it because we hadn't attained the new perspective that change can lead to. And from that perspective, there it is, the hidden wholeness. What seemed partial or what seemed like loss is now whole again. So, here's what we've learned about how to deal with endings. We want to honor the ending, but not worship it or minimize it. An ending may be permanent, but that doesn't mean absolute finality. Second, we need to examine and re-examine our metaphor for life and look at what that might be doing to our attitude towards change, because that metaphor is operating consciously or subconsciously. One way or the other, we need to look at it. Consider the metaphor of the seasons and the idea that change is the scattering of new life or new ideas. And then we finally have the wisdom of Thomas Merton, who tells us that change can reveal the hidden wholeness. So, once we're done with the work that it takes to transform our attitude towards endings, it'll be time to look into the 4 stages of an ending, because we're still on the ending here, and endings have 4 stages. This is an idea that Robert got from the work of William Bridges, who was an author and an organizational consultant. And so the 4 stages of an ending are disengagement, disidentification, disenchantment, and disorientation. You're going to get dissed in this process. And that's where we're going to pick up again next week. See you then.